Welcome to the Stark Reflections on Writing and Publishing podcast. There has never been a better time for writers. More information, options, and opportunities are available to you, but navigating these requires insight. Join Mark Leslie Lefebvre as he draws upon more than a quarter century of experience as a writer, a bookseller, and a trusted book industry consultant to explore and reflect on the writing and publishing landscape to help you make informed choices on your writer journey.
Hello, Reflectives, and welcome to episode 50 of the Stark Reflections podcast. They say we would never make it to 50. Who are they? I don't know. Maybe nobody said that. But anyways, we're in episode 50. If you've been along from the beginning, thanks for sticking around on this ride. And if you are a new listener, then welcome. You are joining an awesome group of people. Unfortunately, you'll not be hearing from them. You'll be hearing from me and my guests. You won't really hear much from the other amazing folks who are listeners, apart from the occasional comment on the show notes or some social media responses. But trust me, they're pretty cool peeps. And now, you're one of those cool peeps too. I started this podcast at the beginning of 2018, and I did it in order to continue to stay in touch with writers and folks from the industry. I wanted to keep learning as a writer, and also as an industry representative, I wanted to keep learning and asking questions and continuing to grow my own experience and knowledge. I was going to use that for my own writing. I was going to use that for my own one-on-one coaching, and now, of course, I'm using it in my new role as the Director of Business Development for Draft2Digital. So a lot has changed since I started episode 1 back in January of this year, and I wanted to talk a little bit about that in this one. So producing a weekly podcast takes a lot of hard work and energy, but it's really all worth it. And it's not just for the ongoing learning that I've benefited from doing this, but it's also for the community. And I want to thank you, the listener, for being part of that community. So I thought, as I mentioned, that for this 50th episode, I'd share a few patterns that I've detected along this learning path. And so, for this episode, I'm going to be covering 5 things that I learned in the first 50 episodes. Although, if you're doing the math, you'll see it's really only been 49 episodes, unless you count episode 0. Although that was really just a short teaser. Oh, heck, this isn't a math podcast. It's a writing and publishing podcast. And saying 5 lessons from 50 just sounds nicer. The 5s, they kind of work together, right? Consider it poetic license. Although, again, on second thought, since while I was crafting this episode, I'm also learning too. So I am learning while I'm doing it. So in a sense, this episode is included in the learning of the first 50 episodes. But that's too introspective and multi-layered and complex. Let's just move on, shall we? But before I get to the main content for this podcast, I wanted to pause for a word from this episode's sponsor. This episode is sponsored by my series of books about writing and publishing. The Stark Publishing Solutions imprint books include the 7 P's of Publishing Success. What 7 traits do the most successful authors have in common? What long-term strategic approaches should you focus your energy and effort on? Regardless of whether you want to pursue traditional publishing or self-publishing, these fundamental elements of publishing success will help you stay on track. The other book is Killing It on Kobo. Tap into the mind behind the creation of Kobo's self-publishing platform and leverage 6 years of working for this global retailer. Leverage these insights to optimize your titles for global sales and maximizing your profit selling your ebooks on Kobo. And if things work out, the original book I'd been writing when these 2 spin-off books popped out should be out in February 2019. And that one is entitled Indie Publishing Insider Secrets, and it's an overview of my 25 plus years on writing, book selling, and publishing experience. For a little bit of my thoughts on some of that experience, you might want to check out a recent podcast that I was a guest on. I was interviewed by John Bard of the Disruptors podcast, and I appeared in episode 5 recently. And this episode is entitled How a Traditional Author Became a Master of Digital Publishing and How You Can Too. I love that John calls me a digital evangelist, and here's a really short clip from John's awesome intro.
What happens when a well-published print author and successful bookseller decides to change course completely and become an evangelist for a digital publishing future? You're going to find out today on this episode of Disruptor.
From the edges of publishing, it's Disruptor, celebrating the rebels, mavericks, and weirdos of the publishing industry and encouraging each of you to disrupt in your own.
Okay, I'll admit, I like being called a weirdo as much as I like being called a maverick. But that's enough of advertisements and little updates. Let's get on with the main topic for this episode. 5 things I learned in the first 50 episodes. Holy crap, it sounds like I'm in a sewer. Number 1, global is more global than global. We talk, particularly in indie and self-publishing, about reaching a global audience. I mean, you often can't mention Kobo without talking about the 190 countries that Kobo sells in. I started blogging in the early 2000s, and I was delighted when I found out that I had readers from all over the world. Wattpad, for example, has helped me reach readers in so many different countries as well. But I never suspected that my reach for this podcast would be so worldly so quickly. I really thought I might get some listeners in Canada, the US, maybe the UK and Australia, but as of this week, as of episode 50, the Stark Reflection podcast has been downloaded in 59 countries. The most popular countries are US, these are in order, US, Canada, Australia, Germany, South Africa, Norway, New Zealand, Spain, France, Belgium, Netherlands, Thailand. But there's still double-digit downloads in the following countries: Nigeria, Japan, Ireland, Sweden, Austria, China, Italy, Guam. And yet even more listeners in other countries like Brazil, Saudi Arabia, Denmark, India, Portugal, Peru, Greece, Turkey, Colombia. If I mentioned the country that you're listening to this in, then hey, a quick shout out to you. Thanks for listening. If I didn't mention your country, my apologies to you, because I know there are also listeners from Tanzania, Singapore, Costa Rica, Mexico, and the Bahamas. Wow! And here I thought that maybe this podcast was only listened to by folks in, Canada, the UK, Australia, New Zealand. And that caught me by surprise. That's something I learned. But a big hello to you, no matter where you are in the world. Thanks for listening, and I hope you're amused by my Canadian accent, eh? Do any of you play drinking games anytime I say the word about? Anyways, speaking of shoutouts, I appreciate hearing from folks who are listening to the podcast, no matter where you are in the world. I mean, I love hearing your feedback on what you like, what you don't like, what could be improved, what you'd like to see more of, what you'd like to see less of. For example, Beth recently shared a post on Facebook about how something from this podcast triggered a personal motivational poster for her own writing. I love that. And I also learned in the past year that backlist podcasts can be like your backlist books, and also that global is also local. Because back in 2006, I was a guest on the Writing Show podcast hosted by Paula B. Paula B is from California, and it was a great podcast that I loved. It was fantastic. Even listening to backlist episodes is great. But earlier this summer, a woman approached me at my author table in Hamilton and said, "Hey, I remember you and your book, A Canadian Werewolf in New York, from Paula's podcast." And she said she remembered it because, like her, I was from Hamilton. And even though this is a podcast that was, produced from a host in the U.S. and California, I was able to connect with somebody from Hamilton, 12 years later because of this backlist. So global is local. Backlist is new. A book you haven't read before is a new book, which is a slogan from Bay Used Books, an old bookstore from Sudbury, Ontario, that is still around. A fantastic used bookstore. But global, local, front list, backlist, the magic and the power of podcasting, all thanks to you, the listener. Number 2, the power of feedback. And does anyone ever notice the way I love to segue from point to point? I talked about the appreciating the feedback. A few months ago, I put out a survey so that listeners could provide anonymous feedback on the podcast, and I really truly value the feedback I've received. So thank you to everyone who's taken the time to fill out the survey to let me know the things you've enjoyed, the things you didn't like so much, and the things you'd like to hear more of. It was really interesting that one of the common themes that I picked up from a number of the surveys I got back was that for the sponsor segment of the podcast, which used to be, in the early days, it used to be me reading a tongue twister. The people who responded and mentioned this, they said they understood why I had the sponsor segment and they appreciated that, but they ended up skipping or hitting that forward 15 seconds button when they were listening to the podcast because they just wanted to get through the tongue twister segment because it wasn't really bringing them anything of value. And so, while nobody mentioned this specifically, I'm pretty sure that my goofy song "Twisting by the Fool," which I started to use as an intro for that segment, that probably made that segment even more off-putting. So my apologies to all of those of you who have suffered through that. I mean, I see the way that my partner Liz's eyes roll whenever I start to sing, and I do it quite often because I really honestly believe that the world needs more people to just break into song and dance like in a musical. But that's just me. So last night, I started singing Stairway to Heaven when we were cooking dinner. And I had good reason. I was prompted to because she asked me to do this. She said a little sprinkling of cinnamon onto the apple she was slicing for the apple crumble she was making for dessert. And when she said sprinkling, I thought of the phrase spring clean from the Led Zeppelin song. It's from the part of the song that goes, "If there's a bustle in your hedgerow, don't be alarmed now. It's just a spring clean for the May Queen." And of course I can't mention or sing that without the next line coming to me. Yes, there are two paths you can go by, but in the long run, there's still time to change the road you're on. Ah, yes, it makes me wonder. And I'm not just goofing around with lyrics here because those lines offer a valuable point for writers. There are two paths you can go down. Heck, there's more than two paths, not just traditional publishing and self-publishing, but all the variations and the various hybrid combinations that can create multiple paths for you in your writing career. And in the long run, you can change the road you're on. See? I can combine my love of music and earworms with an insight about writing and publishing, so not all is lost. There's still some value there. Wow, that was quite an aside, wasn't it? But just in case you now have that Led Zeppelin song stuck in your head, let's clear it out, right? If you have that earworm stuck in your head, let's clear it out by replacing it with an old Dire Straits classic. So, for old time's sake, and so you can laugh at me one more time, or if you're a new listener and have no idea what I'm talking about, here's a quick sample.
Twisting by the, twisting by the, twisting by the, twisting by the, twisting by the pool, twisting by the pool, twisting by the pool. Such a fool.
Now, don't worry, I'm not going to do a tongue twister. Maybe that song helped listeners more easily identify the part to skip. In any case, I ended up dropping that bit, the tongue twisting bit. Doing the tongue twister was extra work on my part, and it perhaps even took away from the straight out ad read or mention of the episode's sponsor. And this isn't just valuable for myself and for improving my podcast, but it's a theme that's come out again and again countless times with very successful authors in many of the previous episodes. So looking back, you'll likely find, like I did, a common theme among authors who are doing really, really well related to feedback and engaging with and listening to their audience. Now, I can look back at interviews with T.S. Paul from episode 13, Natasha Bajema from episode 16, Stina Holmes from episode 17, for examples on how that engagement with and interactions with their audience has really enabled and powered their writing careers. In fact, the types of things that helped inspire me to start my Free Friday Frights weekly, the free releasing of my fiction and nonfiction, that darker and eerie writing, and it's just part of working at providing to the community in a way that allows readers and listeners to comment. Now, speaking of comment, I am always open to surveys, and there will be a link to the Stark Reflections survey at starkreflections.ca for episode 50. So you can provide me feedback on an ongoing basis. It'll be open for a long, long time. I mean, even if you just want to yell at me for playing that song again, but come on, I put a lot of work into doing that Twisting by the Fool song. I had to do it one more time, make it worth the effort. But in any case, that is number 2. But for what I just spoke about, it kind of leads into the next of the five items, number 3, which is the power of community and thinking outside the regular promos. As mentioned in number 2, Natasha used crowdfunding from her reading community, keeping them along as she was building her works with insights into the process as she was working on releasing this series of novels. Stina continues to engage with her community, sharing her love of travel, but also sharing authentic insights into her life as an author, and how that leads to credibility in the characters that she writes. But it goes beyond that. In episode 26, Armand Rosamila shared his experiences doing the Beers and Fears brewery tour, and that inspired me to try something different. Now, I had been doing Comic-Cons and having author tables at Comic-Cons as a different way that wasn't just standard bookstore or library appearances. But I started doing pop-up store events at a local brewery after chatting with him. It would cost me more time than money, despite having to purchase a canopy structure. So the pop-up venue was outside, and that structure helped keep my bald head protected from the sun on sunny days, but it also kept me and my products, my books, protected from the rain. Because it was rainy or misty at least 3 of the Saturdays when I'd been set up for that bookshop. But this allowed me to connect not only with the brewery owners, Lindsay and Joe, the owners of Grain and Grit Brewing in Hamilton, fantastic. They and their staff were a lot of fun to spend time with. But I also got to meet and interact with many other small business owners and vendors from the local community. And that's important because especially when you're in a work from home situation like I am, or you're a full-time writer, where you are spending most of your time at home by yourself, or even if you're at coffee shops, you're not interacting with people so much as you are writing. To get out there and to make an effort to engage in the physical world. And remember, as huge as ebook sales and growth are, that still 70 to 80% of readers don't read ebooks. The majority of people who read get the reading from physical print books. And there's a huge market of people out there who will never discover your books on Kindle or Kobo or Apple or Nook or any of those digital-only platforms. They'll discover them on Barnes & Noble, not Nook, because that's print books, or on Amazon rather than the Kindle aspect of it. And that's where the digital-only stuff may not help you in that regards. And so that's just one of the other elements or layers to think about when you're thinking about promotions. And yes, community is digital, and all the online folks that you can interact and engage with are digital, and that's great. But there are also ways to engage with potential readers in the physical world, and not just local things like libraries or bookstores or breweries or local craft festivals or Comic-Cons, writer conferences. A lot of great learning and connections are made at multiple writer conferences, whether they're local or whether you have to travel to them. Over the past year, you'll notice in different episodes I focused on or even shared full episodes talking about conferences I've been to, Superstars Writing Seminars, NINC, or Novelists Inc., 20 Books to 50K, the WMG Publishing Business Masterclass, Calgary's When Words Collide, and many other places where I had the privilege of interacting with other writers, with publishing folks, with retailers, with readers. And so, of course, connecting with people naturally then leads me, as I love to segue, into the next point which I wanted to highlight, and that is the continuing growth and importance of collaboration. Now, I said this during a talk I did in LA in 2014, Writers of the Future, and I've said it repeatedly over the years. It's even one of the 7 P's of publishing success in that book, although in the book I call it partnership because, well, that starts with a P and collaboration doesn't. But you get the point. I talked about Armand Rosamilia in episode 26, working collaboratively not only with other writers that he was touring with, but also with local indie craft breweries. Get the connection? Indie author, craft, indie brewery, craft, etc. Talked about it as well in episode 9, Chuck Heinzelman of Bundle Rabbit. And then later on in episode 27, Jamie Ferguson, who is a power user of Bundle Rabbit, talks a lot about collaboration and using tools like Bundle Rabbit for collaboration, curation, and for bundles. Great examples of collaboration. But then there's also the various collaborative projects. Dave Sweet and Sarah Graham from episode 43 working on Dave's life as a homicide detective, and how the two of them, that right-wing and left-wing person, or the liberal and the conservative, were working together to help balance one another out and create a really strong work. Not only is that great collaboration, but it speaks to how we could and should be able to collaborate together to make the world a better place, looking for the things that we have in common and finding a path to success rather than butting heads. You have collaborations like Laura and Daniel Martone, the husband and wife collaboration team from episode 24, and how they play off each other's strengths in a very similar way. I mean, yes, they're already a couple, they're already working together, but one is good at outlining, the other one's good at fleshing out the details. The same sort of power you find with not a couple, but writing friends, Carrie Flanagan and Chuck Harrelson, in episode 45, writing this new genre, C.K. Wiles. Then you have different collaborations where you have colleagues. So Dana Ferrant and Barb Stillmer from episode 30. They're professional speakers who work collaboratively with one another, as well as with me via a business mastermind that we participate in together with a group of other people. But there's support, there's fresh perspective, and there's sharing each other's expertise with a colleague so that they can benefit from the thing that you know really, really well. And I've benefited from that as well. Then you have folks like Jay Thorne and Zach Bohannon from episode 21. They not only collaborate in their writing, but they collaborate in their podcast, the Career Author Podcast, which I listen to every week, as well as multiple collaborative projects like their Authors on a Train or Night of the Writing Dead, or collaborating with Brian and Jim from the Sell More Books Show podcast for their Sell More Books show summit that they do in the spring in Chicago. And if you're just getting started in writing and you don't have people to collaborate with writing, then look back at episode 18 where I interviewed Ricardo from Readsy. And Readsy's yet another one of those great platforms where you can find people to hire, or in other words, to collaborate with. So collaborating with other people is a really important aspect that I think is going to continue to grow. And you can see it in so many different episodes from the first 50 episodes, that collaboration is a very, very common theme. And speaking of common themes, it kind of leads to the very last point. Number 5, branding and professionalism. In episode 29, Terry Fallis spoke about writing with authenticity, and it's a theme that Stina Holmes from episode 17 focuses on as well. And in both episodes, we get into some excellent details about writing with authenticity, but also authenticity with respect to the author's brand. In episode 4, Robert J. Sawyer spoke a lot about author branding and how his fiction has been leveraged for him to be a popular and much requested speaker about science and scientific principles and discoveries, like cutting edge of new science things, which is excellent branding that leads right back to his fiction. Now, I've done branding with respect to the horror element of my persona. So I have Barnaby Bones, my full-size skeleton companion. That's a more physical element of the brand, but it's good to share because it's an easy thing to see. It's an easy reminder of those things. Like, what are the subtle things about you and your author brand that are memorable? What are the things that you are doing to enhance and support the author brand that you want to portray? In episode 39, I shared a chapter from my 7 P's of Publishing Success talking about professionalism. Professionalism is definitely a part of your author brand. There's an element of consistency to you as an author, just as there are to the characters that you're creating. So character A in your story, for example, might not say such and such because it would be out of character for them. The same thing holds true for you as an author and you as a brand. And that's something that you might be able to apply from your own writing skills to your author brand. Consider how that thing you might want to post or do or say or engage in would read if you were a character in a story. Would it be true and realistic? Would it be in character? Would it be on brand for that person to act that way? It's a question you can ask yourself related to your writing skills with your author brand. That's one way of approaching it. But let's go back to authenticity for a moment. From my own experience on this podcast, I found that listeners have resonated most with those moments when I'm not trying to pretend that I'm on a stage and presenting something or teaching something, but rather when I'm authentically sharing something from me and from my life. Something about my own learnings, my own experience, my own mistakes, my own failures. Sharing the things that I've tried and that haven't worked can be just as important as sharing things that I've tried and have worked, because it demonstrates that we're all in this together. When a listener hears me talk about a goal in one episode, and then a few episodes later I provide an update and share that the thing I expected to happen didn't turn out the way I had planned, they can see that they're not the only ones struggling. They can see that even though we mostly only hear about the success stories because those are the interesting ones to report, right? We rarely hear about the dozens of aborted or failed attempts that had to happen in order to get there. It's like when a reader reads that excellent scene that you wrote, that's in a published story or book. They might not realize that it's the final version from an edited and polished piece that looks nothing like the original crappy first draft that was hastily slapped onto the page during NaNoWriMo, for example. Or that it's a rewritten scene based on feedback that you got from a really good developmental editor or a really solid beta reader that helped you out. They didn't see the 2 or 3 or 4 other versions of that scene left on the cutting room floor. They just saw that one good one. So in my experience, sharing the misses as much as the successes has been a really important part of the Stark Reflections brand. I'm sharing here. After all, this podcast isn't called Shiny Happy Reflections or Inspirational and Uplifting Reflections. It's called Stark Reflections. Yes, of course, I try to maintain a positive outlook and a positive spin on everything because I do believe that there is a way to turn lemons into lemonade. But I don't do that by ignoring the negative or the bad things. I do it by acknowledging and spotlighting those bad things or those negative things, and then and only then can I adapt a positive perspective based on that. I feel that is more authentic, that is more me, that is how I approach life, and I've learned that it's okay to share these things because time and again, when I do that, I hear from listeners who find value in that. And that wraps right back to an earlier item that I shared here, and that's feedback. All these things feed one another. They don't exist in a vacuum. They exist like you, your writing, your community, your feedback loops, your writer friends, your readers, your stories, your articles, your notes, the technologies you use to create and share your words. They all exist collaboratively. And I hope you've enjoyed and benefited from 5 of the many things that I have learned crafting the first 50 episodes of this podcast. And also, as we close out episode 50, I wanted to share a final reflection. It's kind of related back to authenticity and community and feedback and being global. And that's this. Sometimes just having an author hear firsthand that they aren't alone in their own struggles and challenges can be worthwhile and can be helpful. So, from me to you, listen. It's important for you to understand and for you to fully appreciate that you are not alone on your writing journey. I'm in the same boat as you, as are thousands of other writers. We all believe in what we're doing, don't we? We all understand and we all appreciate the magic that can happen between writer and reader in the creation of these words. Whether they're stories that you're making up, they're personal experiences and teachings that you're trying to relay to other people. When you write those words and someone somewhere down the line reads them, you are forging one of the most important elements of humanity, the connections that people can have with one another. That is powerful. And you're doing it, and I'm doing it, and we're all doing it. You're not alone. We're in this together. And I wanted you to remember that because sometimes when you're struggling with those words, when you're frustrated and you encounter what you believe is writer's block and you just can't get those next words out, think about that. Think about that power. Think about that magic and think that the fact that there are tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of other writers out there like you that believe in that same thing, that believe in the magic and power of the writing that you're doing. Don't give up on yourself. Keep at it. You can do this. You've got this. Well, that is the close for episode 50 of the Stark Reflections on Writing and Publishing podcast. This is your host, Mark Leslie Lefebvre. Thanks for joining me for yet another episode. I will be catching you soon in episode 51, where I have a wonderful chat with Rachel Amphlett about her writing and about audiobooks that she's producing. And until then, here's wishing you great writing and good Stark reflections.
Thank you for listening to the Stark Reflections podcast. You can find show notes for each episode at starkreflections.ca.
The music for this podcast, Laser Groove, was composed and produced by Kevin MacLeod. Check out more of Kevin's great music at incomptech.com.